Joining me remotely from Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, is David Williams, a doctoral student in the Department of Pharmacology here at the University of Melbourne, Australia. David is already an experienced herpetologist, having worked professionally with crocodiles, snakes, and other dangerous reptiles. He also has a keen interest in snakebite epidemiology, venoms and anti-venoms. And in Papua New Guinea, where he makes his home, he's done extensive fieldwork, often in very remote parts of the country, in the area of clinical management of snake bites. Among numerous activities, he trains doctors and health workers in how to treat injuries from snake bites and other venomous animals, and was senior editor of the country's first textbook on this topic. And somehow, amidst all this, he finds time to work on completing his PhD. David Williams, thanks for coming along to Up Close today.
It's a pleasure.
Now, David, before we get into talking about your specific research, can you tell us about the types of snakes to be found in Papua New Guinea?
Certainly. Papua New Guinea shares a very common snake fauna with Australia, actually. A lot of Australians will be familiar with the death adder snakes, the taipan snakes, the brown snakes, and the black snakes that we have here in Papua New Guinea, because they have representatives of the same genuses in Australia. Now, for people elsewhere in the world, it's a little bit different. In North America, for example, they have rattlesnakes, which are pit vipers. Australia and New Guinea don't have pit vipers as such. We have what are called elapid snakes, which are front-fanged venomous land snakes that have been very successful at occupying all sorts of niches from the foothills of the Kosciuszko Mountains all the way through Australia's very arid deserts, and then here in Papua New Guinea, right into the most dense tropical rainforests. So they're a very successful group of snakes. Papua New Guinea's biggest snakebite problem is the Papuan taipan in southern Papua New Guinea. Throughout Australia, there are species of death adder snakes, small snakes that look a little bit like a viper. They're sedentary, they sit on the ground for most of the time, hiding, and they won't usually bite anyone unless you actually tread on them or pick them up first. Just like in Australia, we have them all the way through Papua New Guinea, and we've got other species of snakes that are in common as well.
And you have both venomous and non-venomous snakes there.
We do. We've got our fair share of non-venomous snakes. In fact, the majority of snakes here are non-venomous. There are about 120 different varieties, but the deaths from snakebite are all caused by 7 particular species.
So let's look at these venomous snake bites particularly. What are the actual effects of being bitten by these types of snakes, physically, medically? What happens when we're bitten?
Okay, well, the Australian elapid snakes are predominantly neurotoxic, so they have toxins in their venom that target our nervous system, and they're very efficient at doing that. But they also have toxins that can affect the ability of our blood to clot, which means that people who've been bitten by, say, a brown snake may bleed quite catastrophically from all sorts of parts of their body, both externally and internally. And one of the ways in which a person can die from a brown snake, for example, is from an intracranial hemorrhage into the brain, because the blood vessels hemorrhage spontaneously into the tissue. Now, in Papua New Guinea, we have the taipan snake, which has not just extremely powerful neurotoxins, in fact, they're so powerful they actually internalize themselves into the nerve cells, and they destroy the nerve cell from the inside out so that the cell no longer exists. And that's one of the reasons why our patients need to be ventilated with machines for sometimes 5 to 10 days after they've been bitten, because their nervous system, the nerve endings at the interface with the muscles, has been completely destroyed. But they also have toxins that can cause bleeding. So we get patients who present sometimes in as little as half an hour, who will be spitting blood from their mouth. They might be bleeding from cuts and scratches that they have, or bleeding from other parts of their bodies.
David, that sounds, of course, horrific for sufferers of snakebite, but you've written that snakebite is a forgotten problem in much of the world. What do you mean by a forgotten problem?
Well, unfortunately, snakebite has slipped under the radar of public health agencies around the world, and it's probably not unlike a lot of other non-infectious diseases. I think people in the general public maybe don't realise that, like many other areas of life, public health is very political. You have to be able to lobby politicians and lobby the people who've got the money to fund it. And over the past 50 years or so, we've seen that the focus has really been on infectious diseases, because these are the diseases that can spread epidemically through populations and affect millions and millions of people. And as a result of that, diseases that maybe don't spread, things like snakebite, where the snake bites one person, that person's not going to infect anybody, they're just going to get sick and die, have sort of fallen by the wayside in terms of public health importance. We focus very much these days on diseases such as malaria and HIV/AIDS and dengue fever and so on. But snakebite seems to have slipped through the cracks, and as a result, there is no funding anywhere internationally for this particular problem, despite the fact that globally the best estimates that we have at the moment are that it could be somewhere between 85,000 and 125,000 people a year who die from snakebite.
That's internationally.
That's internationally. That's right around the world. And there could be somewhere between 4 and 5 million people a year who are actually bitten by snakes, who actually become sick as a consequence of that. Now, to put that into a little bit of a context, I suppose we can look at the example of dengue fever. And globally, dengue affects about 50 million people a year. And severe dengue fever, dengue hemorrhagic fever, is estimated to kill somewhere between 25,000 and 100,000 people a year. If we compare that to the figures for snakebite, we can see that dengue affects 10 times more than the 5 million people affected by snakebite. But when you look at the number of people who are dying, snakebite's on a par. Yet, despite the fact that there are enormous resources available to investigate the problem of dengue and to try and find solutions to it, there's not a single cent being invested globally to deal with the problem of snakebite.
Going back to Papua New Guinea for a moment, and for listeners outside of our region, we often refer to Papua New Guinea as PNG for short. So how does PNG sort of compare internationally? Is it a big problem there?
Well, if we look at it in terms of epidemiological incidence and mortality, yes, it is a big problem. On a population-based level, there are parts of Papua New Guinea where almost 0.5% of the population are bitten by snakes every year. And in terms of fatality, we have areas in this country where 3 times more people die of snakebite than die from malaria. Yet again, there's very little put into dealing with the problem. Papua New Guinea does buy anti-venoms to treat snake bites. It purchases those from Australia at present because it doesn't currently have local production of snake anti-venoms of its own. The price of anti-venom locally is extraordinarily high. It's almost $2,000 per vial, and sometimes snakebite patients need more than 1 vial of anti-venom.
So what is anti-venom exactly?
Anti-venom is basically a preparation of antibodies that have been produced in a horse, typically. Sometimes it's done in sheep, but in the case of Papua New Guinea, the antibodies are raised in horses that have been immunised with snake venom. So the horses are given very small injections of snake venom, usually in what we call an adjuvant, which delays their absorption into the animal's body and gives the animal's immune system a chance to mount a very good response to those particular proteins. So as a result, the horse develops antibodies that are able to bind to those proteins and help eliminate them from its body. So we harvest those, and they're processed and purified, stabilised and bottled. And essentially that's what becomes an anti-venom, is a solution of immunoglobulins that have been extracted from horses or sheep and are then used in immunotherapy to treat snake bites.
And how is it actually used with the snakebite victim?
Well, it has to be given intravenously, and the current antivenoms that are in use in Papua New Guinea require cold chain storage, so they can only be kept in health centres that have refrigeration, and unfortunately not many of our health centres have refrigeration, and that limits their access and their availability, and it means that patients have to travel very long distances to gain access to antivenom, and the longer the delay between the bite and receiving treatment, the less likely the patient is to survive.
If we go back historically in Papua New Guinea, David, how has snakebite been treated?
Well, from a cultural perspective, Traditional treatments for snakebite here are highly variable. Most people here in the pre-colonial days would have relied on what we would call witch doctors, puri men, to come up with traditional treatments. And of course, if you're bitten by a non-venomous snake, then these traditional treatments will work just fine. But if you're bitten by a snake that's highly venomous, then typically the patient would die. And in PNG culture, that was usually explained away as having been a consequence of somebody else's witchcraft, that somebody had actually used witchcraft to send the snake to bite and kill that particular person. And unfortunately, in this society, sometimes that led to retribution. People would actually be killed for being witches because somebody in their village had died of a snake bite. Looking at colonial times, at that time when Australian administrators were here, we sort of taught the Papua New Guineans a lot of the sorts of first aid that we were using in Australia back in the 1950s and 60s. For example, the use of tourniquets, the use of razor blades to cut open wounds and make them bleed. And we know today that these are actually ineffective and, in actual fact, probably very dangerous types of first aid. If you have a snake venom that causes a patient's blood to stop clotting, the last thing you want to do is go near them with a razor blade. Papua New Guineans are very good at understanding that they need to do something about snake bites. So even though these techniques were taught to people 50 years ago, even today they're still very commonly practiced because that's what people remember from the time before independence. We've been doing a lot to try and redress that. In Australia for the last 25 years, we've used a much less harmful form of first aid, which is the pressure immobilisation bandaging technique that was developed by the first director of my laboratory at the University of Melbourne, Professor Struan Sutherland, in 1979. But it's only been probably in the last 15 years that that technique has started to filter through into Papua New Guinea.
Now, David, can you tell us about your actual research project? What are you looking at specifically, and how are you going about doing that?
Sure. My project was to look at the clinical management of snakebite in Papua New Guinea, to look at how snakebite patients are assessed, diagnosed, treated and managed in hospital environments here, and to try and identify particular syndromes of snakebite envenoming that might be linked to particular species, and to look at the problems that those syndromes present from a management perspective. So what sort of illnesses do the people have that need to be specifically dealt with? And also to look at, well, why do people die of snakebite here? Is it because the venoms of the snakes are so toxic that the people don't stand a chance? Or is it because there are other problems related maybe to their treatment that result in their deaths? So that's basically what we've been looking at.
How are you collecting your data?
Well, we've done a lengthy prospective clinical study of snakebite at Port Moresby General Hospital, and that's the main teaching hospital based in the capital, Port Moresby. Since 2005, we've basically seen all of the snakebite patients who presented with snakebite at that emergency department. We've collected data from all of those patients. We've collected blood samples, urine samples that have been sent for laboratory analysis and for specific laboratory tests so that we could look at different things that are happening, not just to do with blood coagulation, for example, but also looking at things like liver function, the effects of snake venom on the human heart, the effects on snake venom on different organ systems in the body, so that we can try and have a better understanding of what the venoms of these snakes are actually doing, to also understand whether or not the treatment that the patients are getting is actually effective, and to look at what the post-anti-venom complications of snakebite are. So we get a lot of patients who come to the emergency department, they're treated with anti-venom, but they still don't get well. Many of them deteriorate quite significantly and may have to be kept alive on a mechanical ventilator for several days. Now, that again, to Papua New Guinea's health system, is a very expensive exercise, and the resources for doing it are very limited. So we want to try and understand why these patients get into that situation, and if we can, work out ways to try and reduce the number of patients who have these complications.
Your research has a very wide scope. It sounds like a lot of work.
It has been an enormous amount of work.
I know that you're coming close to completing your thesis, and we'll soon have to call you a doctor, but can you tell us what you're seeing that's worth remarking on, even anecdotally? What conclusions have you come up with?
Well, one of the big things here is that we've found that over the last 20 years, the proportion of patients who are actually bitten by one particular type of snake, the Papuan taipan, in this part of the country that's serviced by Port Moresby General Hospital has actually increased quite a lot. In the early 1990s, taipans were responsible for about 80% of the snake bites seen at Port Moresby General Hospital. What we've found is that that number has now increased to almost 95%. And that suggests that the other types of snakes that are found in this area are no longer biting people as often as before, which suggests, of course, that they're no longer here. And certainly the field work that we've done suggests that other species of venomous snakes are actually declining in number compared to taipans. And it may well be that that's because of deforestation and changes in land use. Some snakes, like death adders, once you destroy their environment, the snake is gone. Whereas taipans are very adaptable snakes. They adapt very well to areas of human habitation. In fact, in areas of farming, for example, up here in the agricultural industry, oil palm plantations have an enormous problem with taipans in the southern part of the country because they produce an environment that the snakes are really well adapted to. But looking at the clinical management of snake bites, probably the most significant thing that we've seen is that for the majority of patients, one vial of anti-venom has been sufficient to prevent their deterioration if it's given early enough. But the window of opportunity is only very small. It's something like 4 to 6 hours at the most in order to reduce the percentage of patients who require mechanical ventilation to keep them breathing afterwards. Beyond that period of time, like previous studies have found, a much higher proportion of patients will need that extra medical support for a long period. And the other thing that we've discovered is that most people who die of snakebite don't actually die of snakebite. Unfortunately, what's causing the deaths in the hospital here at the moment are what I guess we could term most politely medical misadventure. Patients who may not have received the right treatment at the right time, patients who might have been incorrectly treated by mistake for some reason, patients who have complications due to poor nursing, who may not have had their airways suctioned frequently enough, and as a result they aspirate fluid into their lungs via the endotracheal tube. That in turn leads to them developing pneumonias and secondary complications of their original problem that contribute to their decline and eventually to their death.
David, finally, what do you think needs to change in Papua New Guinea specifically, and perhaps the world more generally, in order to provide better outcomes for snakebite victims?
All right, well, Papua New Guinea's got two big problems. The first one is that it can't afford the available anti-venom. So it needs another anti-venom product that's not going to cost so much money. So we've actually developed a new taipan anti-venom that will cost significantly less than the current product. And this new product has performed very well in preclinical studies. And this year we're looking at putting it through clinical trials here in PNG to see whether or not it meets the necessary safety and clinical efficacy parameters needed to be able to recommend that it be registered for general use. So that's one of the things, is we have to make an affordable anti-venom available. And that's a problem PNG shares with many other parts of the world where anti-venoms simply are not available for treating snake bites. A lot of health centres don't have the ability to refrigerate anti-venoms, and therefore we have to look at, well, can we stabilise liquid preparations so that they don't need refrigeration, or can we come up with other solutions to the particular storage problems of the developing world? But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much anti-venom is available if doctors and nurses and other health workers don't have the necessary skills to be able to correctly diagnose and treat snakebite patients and then manage their aftercare. So we have to invest also in education and training. And we have to give the health workers in these countries the basic skills that they need to be able to manage this particular problem well.
David, we'll have to leave it there. And we want to thank you very much for being our guest today on Up Close from faraway Papua New Guinea.
No problem. Thank you very much.
David Williams is a PhD student in the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Melbourne. He lives and carries out his research in Papua New Guinea, from where he was speaking with us today via Skype.